on September 29th. This year, we'll be at the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, California, a place that should be on every conservative's bucket list. We'll be honoring Larry Kudlow and Young America's Foundation. A great number of sponsors have already stepped up to be part of our host committee. You'll see their names on the invitation that will hit your mailbox very soon, and we hope you will join us. And then in November, we'll be resuming the long tradition of National Review cruises with a post-election cruise to the Caribbean from November 12th through the 19th on a brand new ship, the Sky Princess. We have less than 2 weeks before the cabins in our group are released. So if you are interested, please let us know as soon as you can. My colleague Jason Wise is a veteran of these cruises. He can let you know what kind of experience to expect. You can reach out to him if you have any questions, or you can go to nricruise.com. And then finally, we're approaching the end of NRI's fiscal year on July 31st. Thank you to those who have renewed your support already. We'd be very grateful for your contribution to help us close our gap and finish strong. It's through your giving that we can promote the National Review mission, William F. Buckley Jr.'s legacy, and the conservative principles that he championed during his lifetime, including through timely discussions with the top talent of NR. Like today's call, which is typically reserved for our general members who get to NRI at $250 and up per year. Although we've cast the net wider today as a special treat, and we hope an encouragement to lend NRI your financial support. Joining us today are National Review Institute Fellows, John O'Sullivan and Kevin Williamson. John O'Sullivan is an editor-at-large of National Review, where he served as the editor-in-chief for almost a decade. He was also a special advisor and speechwriter for Margaret Thatcher, assisting in the writing of her 2 volumes of memoirs. Kevin D. Williamson is National Review's roving correspondent and the author of Big White Ghetto and the Smallest Minority. You can catch him with Charlie Cook on their weekly podcast, Mad Dogs and Englishmen. John and Kevin will introduce our topic, and I'll come back in about 20 minutes or so for our Q&A time. So please go ahead and start teeing up your questions using the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I'll relay those to John and Kevin. And our topic today, the downfall of Boris Johnson and the future of conservatism in Britain. After narrowly surviving a no confidence vote a few weeks ago, Boris Johnson announced his resignation as UK Prime Minister on July 7th, which, as John wrote recently, has left the Tories in a state of excited confusion. I'll turn it over now to John and Kevin.
Thank you so much. John, I can't remember when it was in life that I discovered that Transylvania was a real place and not just a place from vampire stories. I understand you are reporting from Transylvania. Is that correct?
I was on the scene following the trail of Dracula. That's right.
That's good. That's good. In some of the discussion about who's going to succeed Boris Johnson, some of the supporters of a couple of the female candidates have said, well, it's about time the Conservative Party had a female leader. And as I recall, you know something about female leaders in the Conservative Party, so maybe we'll get back to that in a second. But I wanted to start with the actual downfall, if you will, of Boris Johnson, who was an extraordinarily colorful character, someone who had a great deal of electoral success and a kind of funny shock of blonde hair. I don't think we have to belabor all of the points of comparison with Donald Trump, but certainly a familiar figure in the terms of the sort of place in the political world that he occupied in some ways. But I wonder, what was it in your view that really was the last straw for him? You know, his habit of not being especially scrupulous about the truth was well known, and there were many examples of it before the things that finally seemed to have caused his downfall. He was involved in, a number of kind of minor and petty but embarrassing scandals. And why here and now, do you think? What was the turning point?
Partly it was because there was a strong and effective campaign by people within the party and in the media who essentially hated him. One of the interesting things about Boris is, although he has a lot of the qualities that you mentioned a moment ago, which are fundamentally friendly qualities, whatever else you think, and the fact is, he is a man apparently without malice. I mean, he's taken a lot of abuse in the last couple of years, and yet I can't think of an occasion when he's returned it, except in the semi-jocular way that is legitimate across the dispatch box in the House of Commons. But despite this essentially friendly quality, he was hated, and that's not too strong a word, by a lot of people. Now, some of those people hated him because of Brexit. And again, the problem with Brexit from their standpoint and for him is this: they don't believe he really believed in Brexit. And they thought that he decided to back it because it would advance him. I think that's a simply absurd theory for two reasons. One is there's no evidence that he didn't believe in Brexit. There is evidence that he hesitated, but if you look at his columns over the years in the Daily Telegraph, being for Brexit was the most natural culmination of those ideas and arguments. Now, the second thing is that he did believe in Brexit, but this was something which, for a significant section of the media, the establishment, and the left of the Tory party, was beyond the pale. And the fact that he carried it through, whether he believed it or not, was something that they couldn't give him anything but dislike and hatred for. Now, there were individuals who were very much involved in the campaign against him. Obviously, Dominic Cummings, his former aide, who himself was somebody who was an architect of Brexit. He was plainly engaged in a series of leaks of photographs, all of which were designed to bring about Boris's downfall on the basis that Boris had insisted on stern regulations the British people had to live under during COVID, and they had not been able to go to weddings, they had not been able to go to funerals, they hadn't been able to attend the bedside of their dying parents, and yet he had essentially ignored these regulations and rules in his own conduct in office. Well, frankly, most of that's not true. I mean, I'm not saying he wasn't economical with the truth at times, but I think the attacks on him were more economical with the truth. By this, I mean, Boris, during the period we're talking about, except when he himself was ill with COVID, he was working. I mean, he wasn't, in fact, staying at home. He wasn't, in fact, although he has an apartment in Downing Street, he wasn't taking time off. He was working full time. Boris is a workaholic. I mean, he's not a party boy. He doesn't much like parties. I'm told this by people who've been friends of his for a very long time, and so what he was nailed for was for breaking the rules, which were something grossly exaggerated when he was enforcing a regimen of draconian regulations. And that itself is misleading, because he was the minister, but there were others, but he was the main one who was most skeptical about the lockdown, most determined to end it, who acted in the end again and overruled after 2 years the advice of the scientists, half the government, and so on, to say we've got to end this, we've got to go back to normal life. Now, I do fault Boris that he didn't take that action sooner, but I don't fault him for having for some time imposed the regulations. I think that it would have been impossible for any democratic series of politicians in the cabinet to have simply ignored the advice of all the senior scientists at the beginning of a pandemic, even though from the beginning one could forecast that it would probably not cause anything like the number of deaths that the scientists predicted. So all of these things come together, that the people are getting some enemies of his, some just the general public who don't like him anymore, have in a sense made him a scapegoat for the lockdown, for all of the feelings that we wasted 2 years. We now have to pay the bill for the lockdown. And, the whole political system, in my view, in Britain and in other countries, deserves the responsibility and the blame for that, but he's carrying the can. So that, I think, is the basis of the hatred of him.
Yeah. My favorite Boris Johnson mini scandal was skipping COVID policy meetings because he was trying to finish his Shakespeare biography because he needs money to pay for a divorce. Of all the great American political scandals, none of them ever involved someone trying to finish a Shakespeare biography while he was in office. I think that's a kind of charming scandal to have.
Boris is the kind of character who, as you've probably seen the clip on television, was able to quote the opening couple of pages of Homer's Iliad and to do so in perfect Greek.
Yeah, he is a highly educated guy. You will know this a lot better than I will, having been part of this world, but I have a sense, perhaps naive, that the British Parliament has a degree more self-respect than the American Congress does, that it takes its role a little more seriously, that it's a little less deferential to prime ministers, including prime ministers of their own party, than American congressmen are to presidents of their own party. And it seems to me that there was a particular sense that Parliament was offended at being lied to by Boris Yeltsin as opposed to the public at large, and that they took this as a kind of institutional affront, setting aside the obvious thing that the Tory party is, of course, a bed of snakes, and there's all the careerism and all the rest of the stuff that goes into that.
Well, I think that if we were to go back to the time of, let's say, Watergate, you could turn on a television program, probably in the United States, and have somebody say, what this shows is that the British are better at getting rid of scoundrels than we are. It's taken all these years, they would have done it very quickly. I think we always tend to a sense, particularly in democratic politics in both our countries, to want to blame the system, and therefore to search for examples in other countries which seem to have done it better on this occasion. I think this was quite a ruthless move. I mean, it wasn't anything that happened, as a result of long, slow deliberation. I mean,
so you don't think there was a lot of sincerity to it? You think it was just partisan or factional opportunism?
Well, I think factional opportunism is probably the absolutely correct term, because it wasn't the majority of the Tory party. It wasn't, the Labour Party's opposition to any Tory prime minister can be taken for granted. It was the opposition of the factions in the Tory party and of factions in the establishment who couldn't stand Boris and wanted to get rid of him. And some of those factions were, of course, led by former associates of Boris, like Dominic Cummings, whom I mentioned a moment ago. So, yes, factional opportunism and an extraordinary, again, I go back to my earlier point, an explosion of anger of a general kind, and what's happened in Britain since 2000, beginning of 2020, and a desire to punish someone. And Boris was an all too convenient and obvious scapegoat. So I do think this is, among other things, not the only explanation, among other things, this is scapegoat politics. And he's being blamed for the lockdown and the consequences, which we are now going to be suffering. Now, he deserves that, as I say, in some measure, but not in full measure. And he deserves it in much greater measure for the fact that he's been pursuing policies which are completely contrary to the general impression of his politics. General impression is slightly wrong, come back to that, but general impression was he was a strong conservative. And yet he's been pursuing policies on the climate, on spending, and a series of other things which are the opposite of conservative. And so he had to carry the can for that. But again, those policies like net zero and climate change, they're the policies of the entire political establishment, both parties. And so the fact that he's carrying the can for the consequences while the policies are continuing under the new dispensations, I think that tells you a great deal about the hypocrisy of politics and about why we should, you get the impression, I think, Kevin, fair to say, probably, that I'm softer on Boris than most other people. And I am, but I'm not soft on him because I have a strong affection for him. I have admiration for what he did at the time of Brexit. It was very skillful. It wasn't completely skillful. He left some tangles which he is still trying to unravel. But he did something which represented what the British people wanted, and which they were being prevented from getting by the most extraordinary 3 years of parliamentary and civil service obstruction. And I think that's why there is such a disquiet in the Conservative Party as a whole. I would say Boris is out, but he's not down. Yeah. He's not completely finished in politics. I mean, this week we've had demonstrations outside Downing Street calling him to come back. We've had some of the Tory donors funding appeals that he should be the third name on the ballot paper that goes to Tory members for the leadership. We've had barnstorming performances by Boris in Parliament in the last 10 days. And the general feeling is that he has kind of already begun to arise from the grave, even though he has suffered this tremendous reverse. We haven't heard the end of Boris. We don't know in what form he will come to trouble us next.
Let's talk a little bit about his potential successors. What can you tell me about Sunak and Truss?
Well, I think, first of all, the first thing I'd like to say is today, the Tory party, which has made a lot of foolish mistakes and is in a very bad state indeed, it nonetheless dodged a speeding bullet, because there was a real chance that Penny Morton, the third member in today's ballot, might have gone on to might have been one of the two, going on to meet the memberships in the country. Well, that didn't happen. It didn't happen narrowly. And there was a strong campaign of an extraordinary kind to get her that position. She, in my view, I think I won't mince my words, is a dangerous crank. She is in no sense a conservative. She has bought wholesale the gender ideology and was proud of asserting at the dispatch box as a junior minister that a trans woman is a woman, full stop, no qualification. There has been in the last over the weekend, there was a tremendous barrage of embarrassing revelations, some of them directed by people who are plainly hostile, others who just had worked with her and thought poorly of her as a minister. But the general impression, which I think she has left, is that she's essentially a student union president airhead, and she has just been way over promoted. And the Tory party is lucky she's not in the final two. Now, the two people
seems like someone who has a name that clearly came out of a Charles Dickens novel was just destined for a career in public life.
Yes, she's quite an operator in that sense. So, I mean, what I've said, when I call her a dangerous fanatic, I'm not calling her stupid. Yeah. Although, by the way, her book is one of the most stupid treatises ever put together between hard covers. And I'm strongly urging people, and particularly you, Kevin, I strongly urge you to review it. Please do. We're doing civilization an enormous service, and I think that the book is something which it's around her neck. She can't recover from that book, in my view, unless we become completely illiterate in Britain. Now, we're lucky we don't have her.
So what can you tell us about Rishi Sunak?
Well, Rishi Sunak. And he is a solid, sober, clever, somewhat too smooth, very bright, kid from an Indian background whose parents put him through Winchester, which is probably the brainiest public school in Britain. Eton is better in a lot of respects, but in pure brain, there's no doubt Winchester, that wins the prize. And he was a successful pupil there. He went on to a great career in business. He made, I'm sure, out of romantic love, a very successful, happy marriage with a billionairess. He is, and the success story that we would all like to have for our own children or children-in-law. Now, the problem is that if you succeed in the modern world of somewheres and anywheres, and you're an anywhere whose job has taken him all over the world, to the United States, he's been a green card holder. His wife has been resident in England, but she has not paid taxes because of the arrangements made for non-doms in taxation law. All of these things are a huge difficulty for someone like him. I would say that he is essentially an economic conservative. He probably has perfectly sensible views on other things. He's shrewd and intelligent, and he's reasonably popular as a person. But he's not the man. If you're a Tory candidate in the north of England, or indeed the south and the Midlands, and the country is going through a very difficult period of rising prices, the economy not slowing down exactly, but not booming either, you wouldn't want to have to sell him on the doorsteps as the ideal prime minister for Britain in these circumstances. In my view, that is the single biggest take against him, really. None of those points I've just made are anything to do with his qualities as a political leader or a man of good judgment. I think he probably is admirable in all those ways.
You think too cosmopolitan to take over for Boris Johnson, born on the Upper East Side of Manhattan?
Well, of course, Boris but Boris is an interesting. Boris's political personality is interesting. Two things: he's a liberal, right? He's not. I mean, he's not a right-wing conservative. But he is a Tory. He always described himself as that. He knew that at university. When the head of his college took him aside and said, Boris, you should really go into politics. And he replied, well, sir, I'm an old Tory, don't you? And that was a fixed element in his personality. Now, the liberal Tory is not unknown in British politics, as you must know. And so there would have been a place for him in that. And he could have been a great prime minister, I think, given his talents. But the fact was, he has certain flaws of character, can't stick to the same subject. He's too optimistic. He's not a detail man. I did work for a prime minister, as you referred to, and she had what I would call administrative stamina. She did all the work she needed to know what the correct policy was, and then when it had been agreed and decided, she then made sure it was implemented. Tony Blair, he did the first, but once he'd issued the press release, he felt that had happened, and he needn't bother about it anymore. So now with Boris. You couldn't be sure that he wasn't more. He was fairly like Blair in that regard, and so he spotted off in all directions, and that's the problem. I don't think that will happen with Rishi Sunak. He's a cooler customer. Now, so
can you tell us about Liz Truss?
I think Liz is another decent, honest, hardworking. She's self-made. She went to Oxford. She got a PPE. There's a big campaign at the moment in London against Oxford PPEs. Politics, philosophy, economics degree, which is argued produces smooth people who fail upwards. And I don't think that can be said of either Rishi or Liz Truss. They both are Oxford PPEs, and so that dominance continues. But I think that the problem for her is she does seem to lack confidence at certain moments. She does not have the smoothness, the apparent effortless self-confidence that Sunak has, but she has grit, and she is from she will better be able to connect with the voter. But having said that about the two of them, plain, I think I respect both. I'm not enthusiastic about either. But what I think has been a cause of enthusiasm and is now a cause of disappointment is that a week ago, it suddenly looked as though the Tory party was an extraordinary fount of ethnic diversity and talent. Mm. And for the last week, we've seen the parliamentary MPs, the Tory MPs, sticking to the establishment candidates very, very clearly. And we've seen, on the other hand, candidates above all, Kemi Badenoch, who's the child of Nigerian parents, born in England, educated in Nigeria, who came back. She's an engineer. She's highly competent. And what's more interesting, she and another ethnic, another woman minister, the Attorney General, Suella Braverman, who is from an Indian background, she and who described herself candidly as a child of empire, and said that she thought the British Empire on the whole had been a force for good in the world. Those two candidates in particular, but also the general fact that, that more than half the candidates for the Tory leadership were in fact members of ethnic minorities, which would that, what's the likelihood of that at the moment in the US? I think there is a likelihood, but probably a little lower than what's just happened here.
Yeah.
And that was a cause, first of all, of interest, second of excitement, and then third of kind of amazement, because in all of the debates, though she was making only modest ground among Tory MPs, among Tory activists and among the general public, Kemi Badenoch's reputation was going up and up and up. I would say, there were other candidates for whom that happened as well. To some degree, Penny Morton, although that reputation collapsed over the weekend. To another was Tom Chuvenhat, who's a kind of moderate conservative former journalist and PR guy, but also served in the army. These candidates were fresh, they were attractive, they were extremely bold and effective in their arguments. And all of a sudden, the Tory party looked like an interesting, lively club, mind joining that place. Now, of course, the fact that this was not reflected in the MPs' votes means that Suella disappeared sometime early last week, and Kemi Badenoch was voted out of the race yesterday. The day before yesterday, and of course we were left with the three. And the other woman in this, Penny Morton, again another kind of insurgent candidate, but she was holed. She called herself kind of HMS Morton because of her naval service, and she was holed below the waterline by a series of torpedoes from, first of all, a former ministerial colleague, David Frost, now in the House of Lords, who said she was never there. She took time off all the time, couldn't trust her, wouldn't pass on messages to the European Union that would make the European Union dislike her. So it was a series of things. And but there is a feeling that Badenoch is a future leader of the Tory party. Suella Braverman will be a major figure. Tom Chuvenhat is on the rise. The sense of the present leadership duo duking it out until September, they are the last of that generation, and there's a new generation coming, and it's a pretty impressive one, and impressive in one way which may surprise you. I mentioned Suella Braverman called herself a child of empire. These two women had blew away the idea that conservatives cannot unapologetically defend themselves against charges of racism from the left. They did it so well that the left was positively angry that the Tory party was proving to be ethnically diverse. And I think that that is a very, very important element. Now, I have one other point, but maybe you want to butt in here and say something else.
No, go ahead, please. What was your other point?
Well, why did this happen? Well, the answer, I think, is clear. I've been looking at social surveys about the representation of political constituencies in the Commons. If you look at Labour MPs, they are significantly to the left of Labour voters, not to the right. That used to be the case, that Labour was on the left, so the Labour MPs were more moderate. They moved to the right. In fact, Labour MPs are to the left of Labour voters. And with the Tories, Conservative MPs are to the left of Conservative voters. Now, there isn't that much difference in economic questions, but they are significantly more socially liberal than the rank and file of the party, both voters and activists. Now, I think that there's no doubt from the opinion polls that had Badenoch been in the campaign for the activists from the word go, she would have won.
What are the sort of live issues for British social conservatism right now? When you're talking about the social issues, what's actually in play?
Well, they are interestingly American ones. Most of the social issues that you and I think of, abortion, for example, gay marriage, they're not issues in British politics anymore. And in a sense, that's in some ways that's it is very bad. Not simply because I'm on the side of thinking those are
I seem to have lost John. Stephanie, are you there?
I'm here. Transylvania strikes again.
Is John locked up there?
Yeah, it looks like he's frozen. So
I wonder if John knows he's frozen. How shall we proceed?
I'm wondering if, Kevin, could you just talk a little bit about your Tuesday article that you wrote? I know you covered this a little bit from the American perspective, but anything else to add to that?
Yeah, well, I alluded to this with John, that I think that there really is a sense, perhaps because of the structural differences between American and British government, that it seems to me that the British Parliament takes its governing role a little more seriously than the American Congress does. The US Congress has been happy, in my view, far too happy to delegate far too many of its powers to the executive branch, to the presidency, and to the administrative apparatus. And I do sense that, for some of the things I read anyway, that Parliament was particularly irritated with Johnson for lying to Parliament as opposed to lying to the public or other people that Boris Johnson has lied to over the years. And if that is the case, I think that speaks well of British democracy, and it's a good sense of institutional health of their country. A few other things that sort of came to mind with this for me was that the British have a habit of sort of concluding that their prime ministers have done the thing that they were there to do and then getting rid of them. You know, Churchill was gone pretty soon after the war. There was a sense in Thatcher's administration that she'd got the country back on track, and they were done with her after that. And I think for Johnson, it was really basically just Brexit. And once Brexit had been accomplished, and not only the referendum, but the particularities of the exit agreement, that his time was pretty well finished. And that with that work being done, his particular foibles and eccentricities and deficiencies were less likely to be tolerated. Now, of course, there is some unfinished Brexit business remaining, particularly with regards to some of the customs issues and some of the trade stuff and some of the questions related to Northern Ireland. But I think those have probably receded enough in the political imagination that they weren't enough to keep Johnson there as a vital and urgent figure to see to the remainder of what needed to be done with Brexit. Do we have John back?
We don't have John back. We'll see if he can jump back on the call, but I did notice some raised hands in the participant list here. But so if you did raise your hand, please type out your question in the chat box, and that's how we'll handle the questions. But I know you were talking with John, Kevin, about the contenders to replace Boris Johnson, and I just had a question about just the process and the timeline for selecting his replacement. If you could speak on that.
Yeah, so the first rounds of voting, as I understand it, are within the parliamentary delegation, and then it goes to conservative voters as a whole, which is what will happen with Sunak and Truss, and so they'll have a choice between those two. And I think that happens in about 2 weeks, if I'm remembering correctly. So it should be a fairly, speedy process. It's another thing that's, we Americans tend to be pretty familiar with British politics, but it's inconceivable that we could replace an American president as quickly and with as little sense of convulsion and crisis as the British can replace a prime minister. I'm not entirely sold on the parliamentary system, but it certainly does have a few virtues, and I think that is definitely one of them. So Sunak is actually not polling as well as you would expect him to, I think. And there's a sense that that he may not do as well as expected. The situation with his wife's non-payment of taxes in the UK seems to be really weighing on his reputation among certain conservative voters. So it will be interesting to see how that shapes out.
It does look like Andrew Studdiford, our colleague, is on the call, and
oh, good.
He raised his hand. So I think Miranda, you can unmute Andrew and let him
bring Andrew in.
The question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hello, Andrew.
Yeah, hi. How are you? How are you?
Very, very good. What do you have to fill us in on that I've gotten wrong or insufficiently?
Well, you haven't got anything wrong. John, of course, was a little charitable about Boris, I think. And so this may be unfair because it's a question that I was really going to direct at John, but on the other hand, you're a knowledgeable fellow. Very knowledgeable fellow. If you go back to net zero, and basically John's view on that was that, and by the way, I couldn't agree more with what John was saying about Kemi Badenoch. If the Tories dodged a speeding bullet in the shape of Penny Morton, they also missed the opportunity to load their gun with a silver bullet, in my opinion, by not choosing her, and that I think they will regret. But we will see. John's view, I think, on net zero is that Boris was left carrying the can, and this was something that he really wasn't deeply into. I'm not sure that's entirely true. If you look at his family, his father has a long record of green fundamentalism. There is his latest wife, who is also a green fundamentalist. He's also very friendly with Zach Goldsmith, who remarkably is in the House of Lords, sitting as the sort of environment sort of guy. Who's a sort of rich man's Rousseau, if you know what I mean. He's always going on about nature, and I think that Boris must take some of the responsibility for that. For a guy who claimed to be on the free market wing of things, to go for, and whatever you think about climate change, there are plenty of ways to deal with it, but a forced march, sort of a la sort of Soviet Russia in the 1930s, is not the way to do it. It's central planning run wild. And Boris was the ideal person to have said, look, this is nonsense. And yet he didn't.
That
And
was sort of mystifying to me in that, the UK is a country with a significant energy industry, and one that could be, if they chose, a much larger one, and is certainly more conveniently situated to serve the energy-starved peoples of Western and Central Europe than, say, our natural gas producers in Pennsylvania and Texas.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's extraordinary, because I think one of the failures of Boris is that he came into office as a sort of insurgent, and yet he was curious. Brexit apart, and we can save the debate about Brexit, which is endless, and whether he got the right type and so on. But what he didn't seem to take advantage of was his insurgent status. He was now the insurgent that seized the crown, but instead of which he oddly played an establishment line, whether sincerely or otherwise, about net zero, but also he failed to take on the woke establishment. Now, if anyone could have taken on woke based on his previous decades in media and showbiz and the intersection of the two, it was Boris. And yet he didn't. And I don't know what you think, Kevin, but I think that one of the reasons he fell is that a lot of people, even within the parliamentary party, also felt he hadn't lived up to expectations.
Yeah. John, I've got a stack of Englishmen here, so if you need to, we can always, you're always replaceable, John, just so you know.
Well, I'm afraid that's true.
Oh, hello, John.
Oh, you Andrew. Hi, good to talk to you. Hi.
John, well, let's see what you think about this. Andrew was saying that he thought that maybe Boris had disappointed people in the sense of not performing as much of an iconoclast and outsider as he could have, particularly when it came to some of the woke issues and the climate stuff and some of the other things that you alluded to. I have a kind of theory that conservatives in government get 2 or 3 permission slips for deviations from polite elite opinion. And once you've exceeded that, you don't get any more. And so Boris pretty well ate up his sort of social capital that way with Brexit, and there wasn't much left over for the other things. What do you think?
Well, there's no doubt about that. In fact, what I was about to say when I disappeared through the trapdoor was that the issues that were now social issues in Britain were those connected with wokeness, with Black Lives Matter, with some of the issues we've imported from America. The problem is, by the way, that the entire civil service, a lot of elite opinion outside government has been, in a sense, converted. The universities are not in quite the state they are in America. There is occasional room for conservative opinions, but they're overwhelmingly the minority, as they are in the United States. And the problem, therefore, Boris faced was, if he had a battle, he had to battle on all fronts simultaneously. There were, maybe he could, in a sense, count on support in the city and from industry on economic questions, but dealing with the police, for example, who are increasingly the paramilitary wing of the Guardian, that has proved very difficult. The police have been, in a sense, ignoring the law in order to prosecute offences which are not legal offences, but which they regard as bad behaviour. So, yes, I think that Andrew is more or less right, is absolutely right about that. And whoever now comes in has been given an even bigger problem than he had, because he didn't deal with it. He made some attempts to do so, but they were largely ineffectual. And when, for example, and here's another trend, another ethnic minority woman, Munira Mirza, who was the head of his policy unit, when she commissioned a report into racial disparities in Britain, and she got a very strong and effective report. Yes, there are racial disparities in Britain. No, they're not as severe as people generally think. They are being handled in various ways. Here's how we can improve that. There was an immediate outpouring of indignation from the kind of left captive race relations industry in the universities and elsewhere, Equalities Commission, and Boris just dropped it, just quietly dropped it. That let down the people who'd written that report, taking serious risks with their reputations. And Munira Mirza, who had commissioned it, left the government. She left it on a slightly different issue a bit later, but I think everybody felt the two things were connected. So yes, there hasn't been a sustained attempt to establish what I would call an equality between right and left in British public life in any way, in any serious way. There have been some attempts. On the other hand, who is going to be better?
Yeah, well, that leads us to a question we did get from one of our listeners here that I'll ask you, and maybe we can close out with this, a little rank punditry. Stuart Suss asked which of the candidates you think would be better able to successfully appeal to the Labour voters in the North who had supported Johnson. I guess I will slightly rephrase this. Which, if either of them, do you think is likely to be able to build something close to as successful an electoral coalition as Johnson did?
If we assume an equal ability to deliver an improved economic situation, or an equal ability to not deliver it, which will be the main factor in electoral success or failure, I would say almost certainly Liz Truss. She is, for two reasons. She's not very, very rich. And secondly, she's from a modest background who undoubtedly rose in the world through dint of effort and application. And also, she's not a very easy figure to classify in social class terms. It's partly her voice, and it's partly her manner. She is much more like a teacher than she is a grand figure. She's not even, although she is obviously a successful upper middle class professional woman, she doesn't come across quite as that in the in her manners and in her speech. Now, there's a drawback to that. One of the reasons that she doesn't have that sheen, so to speak, is she doesn't seem to be as confident. That was why Kemi Badenoch and Suella Braverman were so effective. They were supremely confident, and yet they obviously came from, first of all, somewhat exotic backgrounds, not as exotic as Rishi Sunak, but somewhat exotic. And at the same time, they'd had to make their way as immigrants in British society. And I think there was a sense that we're dealing with real quality people here. They may not have started well, but they've ended very well.
It is interesting the way things have changed in the world, that the guy from the Indian family is the one from the privileged background who may be too wealthy and elite to connect with the average person. That's an interesting development in the world. Well, thank you all for being here. John, thank you. Andrew, thank you for your pitch hitting contributions. And I think it was a pretty good conversation. I'll be interested to see how things shake out in the UK. We'll see if Transylvania can work on its Wi-Fi connections, and maybe that could be a long-term European investment project. Do we have anything we need to close out on, Stephanie?
No, I'll just thank you both, John and Kevin and Andrew, for jumping into the discussion as well. Thank you all for joining us. Remember the Buckley Prize Dinner at the Reagan Library on September 29th, the post-election cruise in November. You can find more information about both of those on our website, nrinstitute.org, along with hopefully supporting us as we close out our fiscal year on July 31st. Thank you so much.